I'm getting ready for some of my summer and 4th of July crafting, so I decided to start this year with 3 new upcycle patriotic crafts. So first up, I got this wooden USA cutout at Hobby Lobby. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with it when I bought it last year, but now I finally have an idea. So I have this old hymnal that I swiped from church. I promised they were going to throw it out anyway because it was damaged. They went through the church and got rid of like all the old ones and they were going to throw them away. So I was like, I'm going to take that for crafting. And I don't know if you know this, but a lot of hymnals have like a patriotic like nation section with a few like anthems like the Star Spangled Banner and America the Beautiful and stuff. So I pulled those out of the book and I ripped them out and I decided to Mod Podge them onto this little USA wood cutout to make a little sign. So you kind of got to do some finagling because I wanted like the titles on some of the songs to show, and I wanted to make sure everything was covered and use the best part because I only had 3 pages to work with, so I had just enough paper. If you don't have an old hymnal lying around like I do, you can print like sheet music off the internet or even use book pages. So for the first page, I just did a coat of Mod Podge and then smoothed down 1 page over top. You can use your fingers. I also used a smoothing tool very gently so you don't rip the paper. And then I did the same thing on the right hand side. And then for the middle, I didn't, normally when you Mod Podge, it doesn't matter if you get Mod Podge like on the top of your paper, but because I was going to watercolor paint this, I wasn't sure how the watercolor was going to work on top of the Mod Podge. So what I ended up doing is on that middle paper, I just did a coat of Mod Podge directly on the paper. It's a little messy and the paper starts to wrinkle, but it worked out just fine. Just because I really didn't want any Mod Podge on top of the paper when I went to go paint. So I did that and then I smoothed that down. And then Florida was looking kind of sad. Like Florida just had like a blank part at the bottom of a page. So I just ripped out a piece of an extra page and I put it right on top just so that it wasn't so blank. And I made sure to always like rip my edges just so that it looked a little like more rustic. And then it's time to trim all the paper. So I did not wait for the Mod Podge to completely dry. I probably waited 15-20 minutes. I felt that it was easier to trim the paper away while the paper was still a little bit wet from the Mod Podge. So I just took a pen blade and my cutting mat and I trimmed all along all the borders. And then you can flip that little map back over and kind of, any parts that didn't get fully cut because the paper's still a little bit wet, the paper just kind of rips away. And then you can kind of, take your fingers and press any dangling, hanging pieces of paper down over the sides of the little wooden cutout. And then once the Mod Podge had completely dried, I came in with watercolors and I just kind of freehanded. So y'all, I'm not an artist and I don't claim to be, although I did take 1 whole semester of drawing in high school. Shout out to Mr. Anderson. But I just kind of painted what I like and I think it turned out pretty okay. So I just started with these flowers and I just made like a dot and then I made little semicircle, little C shapes that progressively got bigger as you went around, and I just kind of like staggered them, different spacing around, and that made little flowers, like little peony type flowers. And I just did that in like the top quarter, upper left quarter, and then filled in all the empty spaces with just little leaves. And that took the place of where the stars would be on an American flag. And then with the rest of the USA, I just took red watercolor paints and made some wavy lines. Kind of like how a flag would look if it was blowing in the wind, I guess. But nothing too fancy. And I mean, if I can paint this, you can paint this because I have zero special artistic skills. And then once everything dried, I came back with just a quick coat of clear acrylic spray. Always use matte on these projects just to kind of protect everything. I wasn't sure how Mod Podge would do on top of the watercolor paint, and I didn't want to risk having any of my paint bleed, so that's why I did the spray. But there's my little finished USA sign, and I'm really, really happy with how this turned out. Second up, I just grabbed some scrap fabric, so like old jeans that had ripped, a button-down shirt that was stained, and then a face mask that I hopefully will never need again, right? So I just really liked the pattern on the face mask, and I was like, well, I don't think I'm gonna need it, so I'll craft with it. And then I also grabbed some drop cloth fabric. So start by cutting a piece of fabric about 4 inches by 6 inches. My wooden dowels were 12 inches long, so this is like the ratio kind of worked out here. And then you can take your fingers or like a seam ripper or even like a Cricut weeding tool and start to fray the edges. Then cut another smaller piece to like mimic the star area on the flag. And this one was about, I don't know, 2 inches by 3.5 inches. You can really change it up. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be very rustic. And then also fray the edges on this one. And then you want to come back and assemble your little flag. So I just held my layers of fabric together with masking tape while I stitched. And then I just took regular thread and a needle and I just kind of stitched back and forth. I found it easiest to start on the bottom of the little rectangle and then work your way up the side and then across the top. That way, when you fold your little flag over the wooden dowel, your thread is already at the top of the flag. And then if you just pinch that fabric really tightly around the wooden dowel, you can stitch all the way down the wooden dowel. And if you hold the fabric tight enough while you stitch, and if you stitch close enough to that dowel, the flag won't slide down like when you stand it upright. And then to finish off the look, I just took a, another piece of fabric and I ripped it. So like cut a little notch and then rip it so that you have frayed edges. And this makes like a little piece of ribbon that you then tie around the dowel at the base of the flag. And then to top it off, I just took a little 1/2 inch wood bead and I hot glued it right to the top of the dowel for the top of my flag. And then just like a little tip here, if you have a hard time making evenly spaced stitches, which I do, take a ruler with a pen and mark little tick marks on the piece of masking tape and then stitch right along that piece of masking tape, and it helps you make nicer looking stitches. Also, if you want to make the flag reversible, I just found it easiest instead of trying to like line up fabric on the front and the back and stitching, I just used like permanent double-sided fabric tape and I cut like a smaller square of fabric and I just taped it right on the back. So here are my 3 finished flags, and then to display them, I actually just used an old molasses jar. So we use a lot of molasses because I bake brown bread, and I just cleaned it up and then used hot glue to wrap the jar with twine. And then from there, I just took some white acrylic craft paint and painted 3 little stars right on that twine. Too easy. And you can display these little flags in, a mason jar, in with fresh flowers, in a plant, whatever you like. And then finally, I grabbed some hardcover books because I really like crafting with books. And these are books that like you can reuse them after this and you won't damage them. So these can be like books that you actually read. And then a roll of brown craft paper. I always buy this at the dollar store, but you could use grocery bags as well. Cut the piece of paper about, I don't know, 1.5 inches larger than the book in all directions. And then start to kind of fold the paper over the book edges. So you want like very light creases. From here, you can then take your scissors and cut little tail ends at the spine of the book at the top and the bottom. And then you're also going to want to cut the two sides on either side of the spine at a 45-degree angle, just so there's less like bulk paper when you go to cover the book. So it looks kind of like a butterfly when you're done cutting. Start by folding those two tabs in right along the spine. Make sure that it's not too short because you don't want any of the book showing, and then you start to fold in all the other edges. From here, I secured everything with painter's tape because I didn't want to damage my book at all. And you just kind of like fold in all those edges, crease it a few times, and then secure it with painter's tape. It doesn't have to look fancy. It's more important that it looks good on the outside than it does on the inside. And then I cut a piece of brown paper and I used really cheap dollar store masking tape because it's not so sticky. And I taped it to a piece of printer paper and ran it through my printer and made this 1776 wreath image, which is a free printable available on my blog, and I will link to it. So you can download and print this yourself, and then peel off that masking tape and trim the paper down to size until it kind of matches the size of your book stack. From there, you want to hold the paper up against the book stack and take a pencil and make little tick marks between each book. And then you can take your paper slicer and cut the printable graphic into paper strips that match the size of your books. Then grab just a plain old glue stick and apply a generous coat of glue to each strip of paper and smooth it onto the book spine. Be sure to like keep track of the order that you cut the paper strips in so you know like which strip goes on which book, otherwise you're going to be dealing with a puzzle. Also be sure that the seam on the tail end of that paper strip is pushed all the way up to the right side, like the bottom of the book, like the right side of the book stack, because you don't want that seam, like the paper showing. You want it to look like it's printed directly on the book, not like you added a piece of paper after the fact. And then from there, there's also that seam on the left-hand side that you want to cover up. So I just used some twine, some cheap dollar store twine, and then red and white baker's twine left over from Christmas. Wrap that around the book stack a few times, right where that other paper seam is on the other side, and then no one will ever know that like you glued the paper on and it wasn't actually printed there in the first place. But here are my 3 little finished Patriotic Upcycle crafts to get me started for crafting this summer. I'm super excited about how these turned out. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, happy making!